In a quiet college town, a routine day ended without warning. A young woman stepped out to follow her normal schedule, surrounded by familiar streets and familiar faces. By nightfall, she had not returned. There was no sign of struggle, no sudden alarm, no clear reason to believe anything had gone wrong. Yet, as hours passed, unease began to spread. People retraced simple movements, checked ordinary places, and waited for a call that never came. What made the situation unsettling was how quickly certainty disappeared. One moment, life followed its usual rhythm. The next, there was only absence. The town did not yet know it was at the start of a case that would stretch across years, across states, and through multiple courtrooms. At that moment, all that existed was a missing person and a growing sense that something had broken from the expected order of things. Before we continue, if you value carefully told investigations like this one, you can subscribe to stay with the series. In May 2004, Brooke Wilberger was living in Corvallis, Oregon, while attending Oregon State University. She was known for her steady routines and regular contact with family. When she failed to return as expected, concern formed quickly rather than slowly. This was not a situation where days passed before questions were asked. The absence was noticed, and it was taken seriously. A missing person report was filed, placing the situation into official records without delay. Law enforcement began working to establish a clear timeline. Attention centered on the last confirmed sighting, which placed Brooke near her apartment complex. Investigators focused on where she had been seen, where she was expected to go, and how much time had passed between those points. Search efforts followed standard procedures for a disappearance of this kind. Officers canvassed nearby areas, checked routes commonly used by residents, and spoke with individuals who might have seen something out of the ordinary. Volunteers joined the effort, responding to calls for help from both authorities and the university community. Flyers were distributed, and information lines were opened. Despite the scale of the response, no clear evidence emerged. There were no confirmed sightings after the day she disappeared. No belongings were found that could explain where she had gone or why she had not returned. The absence of physical clues limited how narrowly investigators could focus. Each possible direction required consideration, but none could be confirmed. As the initial search continued, the tone of the situation shifted. What began as an urgent attempt to locate a missing student slowly took on the weight of uncertainty. Investigators continued to follow up on tips, but many led nowhere. Some reports conflicted with established timelines. Others could not be verified at all. Each was evaluated carefully and then set aside when it failed to hold up. The university community felt the impact immediately. Brooke was not an anonymous figure. She was part of daily campus life, and her disappearance left a visible gap. Students adjusted routines. Families followed updates closely. The case was discussed not with speculation, but with concern rooted in proximity and familiarity. Law enforcement faced the challenge common to many early missing person cases. Without physical evidence or a clear suspect, progress depends on information from the public. Investigators revisited known details repeatedly, ensuring that no early assumption had gone untested. Locations were re-examined, timelines were reviewed. Each step reflected persistence rather than certainty. As days passed, the investigation remained active. The absence of immediate answers did not reduce effort. Instead, it broadened the scope of inquiry. Authorities considered whether Brooke might have encountered someone she did not know, or whether her disappearance involved circumstances not yet visible. These considerations guided continued searches, but they did not produce resolution. By the end of the early period, one fact stood above all others. A young woman had vanished from a familiar environment without leaving a trace that could explain her disappearance. The case had entered official systems. The community had responded. Investigators had acted quickly. Yet despite all of this, the central question remained unanswered. What defined this moment was not failure, but uncertainty. The groundwork had been laid, records were established, evidence, or the lack of it, was documented. The case was positioned to move forward if new information emerged. For now, it existed as an unresolved absence, pressing and immediate, with no clear direction and no indication of how long the search for answers would last. This was the point where routine ended and persistence began. In the days that followed the disappearance, attention narrowed to detail and process. Investigators worked to understand what could be confirmed and what could not. Time mattered, and the early period was shaped by the belief that careful review of routine could reveal something out of place. Familiar paths were examined first. Areas near the apartment complex were revisited. Ordinary movements were treated as potential clues. Law enforcement focused on establishing a reliable timeline. The last confirmed sighting became the anchor point for every decision that followed. Officers worked to determine where Brooke Wilberger had been expected to go and how much time had passed before concern escalated. Each interval was measured carefully because even small gaps can matter in missing person cases. Friends and acquaintances were contacted to confirm recent interactions. Schedules were reviewed. Class attendance and known commitments were checked to understand whether anything had disrupted normal patterns. These steps were methodical rather than dramatic. They reflected the need to build certainty from verified facts, not assumption. Search efforts continued alongside interviews. Teams returned to nearby locations multiple times, ensuring that early checks had not missed something small. Routes commonly used by residents were examined again. Open areas were scanned carefully. The absence of evidence did not reduce effort, it expanded it, because without a clear direction, investigators were required to consider a wider range of possibilities. Tips from the public arrived steadily. Some were based on observations. Others were expressions of concern shaped by fear rather than fact. Each report was logged, assessed, and followed where possible. Many could not be confirmed. Some conflicted with established timelines. When verification failed, they were set aside, not dismissed casually, but documented for completeness. The investigation remained grounded in procedure. Without signs of struggle or recovered belongings, there was no immediate basis to classify the situation beyond a missing person case. This classification shaped available options. It guided how resources were deployed and how information was shared. Investigators balanced urgency with accuracy, aware that premature conclusions could limit progress later. As days turned into weeks, uncertainty grew. The initial expectation that answers might emerge quickly began to fade. This shift did not reflect inaction. It reflected the reality that some cases resist early clarity. The lack of physical clues meant there was no single path to follow. Every potential explanation required examination, even when evidence was thin. The university community remained closely engaged. Awareness campaigns continued, and information remained visible across campus and surrounding neighborhoods. The concern was shared, but it did not transform into speculation. The absence of facts kept conversation restrained. People waited for updates rather than filling gaps with rumor. Investigators revisited the timeline repeatedly, looking for overlooked connections. They examined whether the disappearance could have involved someone unknown to Brooke, or whether circumstances had placed her in an unexpected situation. These considerations were explored quietly, guided by evidence rather than narrative. Throughout this period, records were maintained with care. Notes from interviews, search logs, and tip reports were preserved. This preservation mattered. Even when information did not lead to immediate progress, it became part of a larger record that could be reviewed later if new details emerged. The investigation did not stall, but it slowed into a steady pace defined by diligence rather than discovery. Each step reaffirmed what was already known. Brooke Wilberger had disappeared. There was no confirmed explanation, no clear direction had emerged. The absence of answers became the defining feature of the case. This stage carried a different weight than the first days. The urgency remained, but it was tempered by recognition of complexity. Investigators understood that progress might not come quickly. They continued working within established procedures, keeping the case active and open. By the end of this period, the situation had changed in one important way. The disappearance was no longer just a moment of alarm. It had become an ongoing investigation marked by growing uncertainty. The groundwork had been laid, but the path forward was unclear. What remained was persistence, careful documentation, and the knowledge that answers, if they came, would likely arrive from a direction not yet visible. As time moved forward, the disappearance settled into a different kind of reality. The initial surge of activity gave way to sustained attention, quieter but no less deliberate. The case remained open within law enforcement systems, reviewed and preserved rather than abandoned. What changed was not commitment, but the nature of the work. Without new evidence, progress depended on patience and readiness. Investigators continued to revisit the file, examining earlier steps with fresh perspective. Timelines were reviewed again, notes from interviews were reread, search areas were reconsidered in case something had been overlooked during the early days when urgency can narrow focus. This process was slow and methodical, reflecting the understanding that answers might emerge only through careful re-examination. The absence of physical evidence continued to shape the investigation. Without recovered belongings, confirmed sightings, or signs of where Brooke Wilberger might have gone, there was no single direction to pursue. Investigators were forced to work within a broad field of possibilities, each requiring caution. Assumptions could not replace proof, and speculation could not guide action. Public awareness remained present, though less intense than in the first weeks. Flyers stayed visible in some areas. Her name remained known within the community. Yet without updates, attention gradually shifted. This did not signal indifference. It reflected how unresolved cases often moved to the edges of public focus, while remaining active within official records. The case demonstrated how investigations can persist without visible movement. Law enforcement maintained contact with family members, ensuring that information channels remained open. Any new detail, no matter how small, was treated seriously. Even years later, tips were assessed rather than dismissed. Preservation became a central priority. Every document, report, and piece of information was maintained in anticipation that future developments could provide context. Investigators understood that advances in technology or unrelated discoveries might one day intersect with the case. Readiness mattered as much as action. During this period, the case served as a reminder of the limits of early response. The initial investigation had been timely and thorough, yet it had not produced answers. This reality underscored a difficult truth. Even well-handled searches do not guarantee resolution. Some cases resist clarity despite effort. The passage of time introduced new challenges. Memories faded. People moved away. Details that might have been clear in 2004 became harder to recall with certainty. This erosion affected what could be reconstructed later. Investigators documented these limitations carefully, aware that time can alter both evidence and perception. Despite these challenges, the case remained positioned for movement. It did not close. It did not become dormant. It existed in a state of readiness, monitored and preserved. Investigators remained alert to developments in other cases that might intersect unexpectedly. This period also highlighted the emotional strain carried quietly by unresolved cases. Without resolution, families and communities live with uncertainty rather than answers. The absence becomes part of daily life, neither acute nor resolved. The investigation continued within that space, focused on procedure rather than outcome. As years passed, the case took on the characteristics of a long-term investigation, not defined by dramatic turns, but by continuity. The absence of closure did not end responsibility, it shifted it into maintenance, review, and preparedness. What defined this stage was persistence without direction. Investigators did not know where answers would come from, only that they might come later. The file remained intact, waiting for a connection that had not yet appeared. By the end of this period, the case stood as unresolved but active. Brooke Wilberger was still missing. No explanation had been confirmed. No suspect had been identified. The investigation continued, grounded in the belief that unanswered cases are not finished cases. They remain open, carrying the possibility that one piece of information, arriving at the right moment, can change everything. The direction of the case changed years after the disappearance, not because of a new lead in Corvallis, but because of developments far beyond it. The shift did not arrive suddenly or publicly. It began quietly, as investigators elsewhere pursued their own cases, unaware at first that their work would eventually intersect with an unresolved file from Oregon. Law enforcement in another state arrested Joel Courtney in connection with violent crimes unrelated to the disappearance of Brooke Wilberger. Those investigations followed their own paths, driven by evidence gathered locally and by timelines specific to those offenses. As details were examined, Courtney's movements during earlier years began to draw attention. Records showed that he had traveled through multiple states, including Oregon, during the period when Brooke vanished. This information did not immediately redefine the Wilberger case. Investigators approached it cautiously. Presence alone does not establish responsibility. Timelines had to align, and facts had to support any connection. Agencies began exchanging information, reviewing travel history, employment records, and known locations to determine whether Courtney's movements placed him in Corvallis at the relevant time. The review was methodical. Investigators compared dates, locations, and opportunities. They examined whether Courtney's known patterns could intersect with Brooke Wilberger's last confirmed movements. This process relied on documentation rather than inference. Each piece of information was assessed for reliability before being considered part of the larger picture. As this work progressed, the Wilberger case shifted from an unresolved disappearance to a focused inquiry. For the first time, investigators had a person whose history and movements could be examined against the known facts. This did not resolve the case, but it narrowed the field from uncertainty to possibility. Coordination between jurisdictions became essential. Information gathered in one state had to be shared accurately and lawfully with authorities in another. This required careful handling of records and adherence to procedural standards. The goal was not speed, but accuracy. Any misstep could compromise the integrity of the case. Investigators revisited the original timeline with new context. They examined where Brooke had been last seen and considered how an encounter with someone unfamiliar could have occurred without leaving immediate evidence. These considerations remained grounded in fact. No assumptions were made beyond what could be supported by records and verified movements. The emergence of the suspect did not produce immediate public announcements. Law enforcement continued working quietly, building a case that could withstand scrutiny. The history of the investigation had shown how fragile progress could be when evidence was thin. This time, restraint guided each step. As connections were evaluated, prosecutors were consulted early. Legal standards shaped how evidence could be gathered and presented. Investigators understood that suspicion alone would not be enough. Any future action would require proof that met courtroom requirements, especially given the passage of time. This stage of the case marked a transition in tone. The long period defined by waiting and preservation gave way to renewed analysis. Investigators were no longer simply maintaining a file. They were testing whether new information could unlock what had remained closed for years. The broader context of Courtney's criminal history added weight to the inquiry, but it also required caution. Each case had to stand on its own evidence. The Wilberger investigation could not rely on association or pattern alone. It had to establish its own factual foundation. As agencies worked together, the possibility of resolution became tangible. For years, the case had existed without a focal point. Now there was a direction, even if the outcome was not yet certain. The work ahead involved confirming links, eliminating alternatives, and ensuring that conclusions were supported by verifiable facts. The emergence of a suspect did not erase the years of uncertainty that preceded it. Instead, it reframed them. The absence of answers was no longer permanent, it was conditional, dependent on whether the new information could be substantiated. By the end of this period, the Wilberger case had entered a new phase defined by focus rather than breadth. Investigators had not solved the case, but they had moved closer to understanding how it might be solved. The disappearance was no longer isolated. It was connected, carefully and deliberately, to a broader investigation unfolding far from where it began. With the suspect now under focused review, the work turned toward evidence and structure. Years of uncertainty had produced a large volume of records, each created for a specific purpose at a specific time. The task was to bring those materials into alignment, not by forcing connections, but by determining where facts could be supported and where they could not. This required discipline. The passage of time had not added clarity on its own. Clarity would come only from careful evaluation. Investigators began assembling information from different jurisdictions into a single working framework. Records from Oregon were examined alongside materials gathered elsewhere. Travel histories, timelines, and documented movements were reviewed for consistency. The goal was not to tell a story, but to test whether separate pieces could exist together without contradiction. If they could not, they were set aside. This stage demanded restraint. The existence of a suspect did not change the standard of proof. Each element had to stand on its own. Investigators resisted the temptation to fill gaps with inference. Where documentation was incomplete, it was acknowledged as such. Precision mattered, especially in a case that would face close legal scrutiny. Prosecutors became more deeply involved as the picture took shape. Their role was to assess not only what investigators believed, but what could be demonstrated in court. Evidence was reviewed through a legal lens. Questions were asked about admissibility, reliability, and relevance. Material that did not meet those standards was excluded, regardless of how compelling it might appear outside a courtroom. The consolidation process also required separating this case from others connected to the suspect. While similarities across crimes can provide context, each charge must rest on its own facts. Prosecutors ensured that the Wilberger case was evaluated independently. Association alone would not be sufficient. The evidence needed to establish a direct connection. Timelines were refined carefully. Investigators revisited the day of the disappearance, aligning confirmed events with verified movements. Where certainty ended, the record remained silent. This approach reduced the risk of overstatement and preserved credibility. In older cases, credibility can be as important as content. Physical evidence remained limited, and that limitation shaped strategy. There were no recovered belongings to trace, no scene that could be reconstructed in detail. The case relied on documented movements, established opportunity, and the absence of alternative explanations supported by evidence. Each factor was weighed cautiously. Case consolidation also involved deciding how proceedings would move forward. Multiple investigations touching the same individual can create procedural complexity. Prosecutors considered whether consolidation would promote clarity and efficiency without compromising fairness. The decision reflected legal judgment rather than convenience. Throughout this process, investigators remained aware of the broader context. The community had waited years for answers. That awareness did not alter standards, but it reinforced the need for care. A case built on assumption would not survive scrutiny. A case built on fact, even if narrower, could. Documentation became central. Every step taken during consolidation was recorded. Decisions to include or exclude material were justified in writing. This record-keeping served two purposes. It ensured internal accountability, and it prepared the case for potential challenge later. As the evidence was organized, the case took on a new coherence. What had once been scattered across time and geography now existed within a defined structure. The disappearance, the suspect's movements, and the investigative findings were aligned where possible and separated where they were not. The consolidation phase did not resolve the case. It did not answer every question left by years of uncertainty. What it did accomplish was to define the boundaries of what could be pursued. Those boundaries were essential. They shaped the next steps and protected the integrity of the process. By the end of this period, the investigation had moved from possibility to preparation. The evidence that could support legal action had been identified. Material that could not meet required standards had been excluded. The case was no longer waiting. It was being readied carefully and deliberately for the stage that would determine accountability within the limits of the law. As the investigation moved from preparation to prosecution, the case entered a stage defined by structure and constraint. Years of uncertainty narrowed into a legal framework governed by rules that leave little room for assumption. Every claim had to be supported. Every step had to follow established procedure. The focus shifted away from discovery and toward accountability that could be sustained in court. Prosecutors reviewed the consolidated evidence with care. The passage of time shaped every decision. Physical evidence was limited, and memories tied to 2004 were no longer fresh. This reality did not weaken the case, but it dictated how it could proceed. The legal system does not operate on what seems likely. It operates on what can be demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt. Court filings reflected this restraint. Charges were selected based on provable facts rather than expectation. Prosecutors avoided broad claims that could not be supported by documentation. The strength of the case rested on alignment between verified movements, established opportunity, and evidence gathered during later investigations. This alignment had to be clear, consistent, and defensible. Defense counsel examined the same material from a different angle. Challenges focused on the age of the case, the absence of certain physical evidence, and the reliance on reconstructed timelines. These challenges were expected. Older cases often face scrutiny, not because they lack truth, but because time complicates proof. The court process exists to test that proof, not to assume it. As proceedings advanced, the scope of the case became more defined. The court addressed preliminary matters related to jurisdiction, admissibility, and procedural fairness. These steps did not attract public attention, but they were critical. They ensured that the case would be judged on evidence rather than error. Plea discussions emerged within this context. Such discussions are common in complex cases involving multiple investigations and long timelines. They do not reflect uncertainty about guilt. They reflect evaluation of risk, clarity of outcome, and the interests of justice. Prosecutors and defense counsel assessed the evidence and considered whether a negotiated resolution could provide accountability without the uncertainty of trial. These discussions were shaped by legal realities. A trial would require jurors to assess events that occurred years earlier, without the benefit of contemporaneous physical evidence. A plea could establish responsibility based on facts already supported by the record. This consideration did not diminish the seriousness of the offense. It focused the process on achievable outcomes. Throughout this period, the court maintained oversight. Any resolution would require judicial approval. Plea agreements are not private decisions. They are reviewed to ensure that they are supported by evidence and that they serve the interests of justice. The court's role was to evaluate whether the proposed outcome aligned with law and fact. The broader impact of the case remained present but unspoken within legal proceedings. The disappearance had affected a family, a university, and a community. That impact did not guide legal decisions directly, but it underscored the importance of reaching a resolution grounded in proof rather than speculation. As discussions continued, the contours of the case narrowed further. The focus centered on responsibility that could be established without ambiguity. This narrowing was deliberate. In cases shaped by time, precision strengthens credibility. Overreach weakens it. The legal process also accounted for the broader pattern of criminal behavior associated with the defendant. While each case must stand independently, the existence of related convictions informed how prosecutors approached resolution. Consistency mattered. Outcomes needed to reflect both individual responsibility and the broader legal context. When an agreement was reached, it did not mark an end to scrutiny. The court reviewed the terms carefully. The factual basis for the plea was examined to ensure that it matched the evidence on record. This review served as a safeguard against unsupported conclusions. The acceptance of a plea represented a shift from contested process to acknowledgement. It placed responsibility on the record without requiring a jury to resolve uncertainties created by time. This approach did not erase unanswered questions, but it established accountability within the limits of law. By the close of this stage, the case had moved decisively toward resolution. The years of preparation, review, and restraint had culminated in a legal outcome shaped by evidence rather than assumption. The process had been deliberate, measured, and grounded in procedure. What remained was the formal determination of consequence. The court would soon move from evaluating responsibility to deciding how that responsibility would be reflected in sentencing. The focus would turn from how the case was proven to how it would be concluded within the justice system. The case reached a point where uncertainty narrowed into acknowledgement. After years defined by absence, review, and legal preparation, responsibility was formally accepted within the justice system. This moment did not arrive through dramatic revelation. It emerged through procedure, documentation, and the weight of evidence assembled over time. Joel Courtney admitted responsibility for the killing of Brooke Wilberger. This admission aligned with the evidence that had been evaluated during the investigative and legal stages. It did not rely on assumption or interpretation. It was grounded in facts that had been tested against timelines, movements, and corroborated records. The acknowledgement replaced years of unanswered questions with a clear statement of responsibility. The admission carried significance beyond its words. For investigators, it confirmed that the focus placed on Courtney had been justified. The careful restraint exercised during evidence consolidation and legal review was validated. For the legal process, it established a factual basis that allowed the case to move forward without requiring a jury to resolve uncertainties shaped by time. This stage reflected how accountability can take form even when early evidence is limited. The case had not depended on a single decisive discovery. It had depended on alignment. verified movements, established opportunity, and consistency across records formed a structure that could support acknowledgement without contradiction. The admission did not attempt to reconstruct every detail of what had occurred in 2004. It did not fill gaps created by the passage of time. Instead, it addressed responsibility directly. This distinction mattered. The justice system does not require complete narrative to establish accountability. It requires truth supported by evidence. For the Wilberger case, this acknowledgement marked a turning point. For years, the investigation had been defined by what could not be confirmed. With responsibility accepted, the case shifted toward resolution. The focus moved away from determining what happened and toward determining how the law would respond. The admission also demonstrated the role of legal process in shaping outcomes. It followed months of review, negotiation, and judicial oversight. It was not spontaneous. It was the result of a system designed to test claims and verify facts before accepting them as truth. This moment did not bring immediate closure to every aspect of the case. It did not answer all questions held by the community. What it did accomplish was clarity. The disappearance was no longer unresolved. It was explained within the boundaries allowed by evidence and law. The acceptance of responsibility also reflected the limitations imposed by time. Early opportunities for intervention had passed years earlier. Physical evidence that might have existed in 2004 was no longer available. The admission provided certainty where reconstruction could not. Within the courtroom, the focus remained procedural. The court evaluated whether the admission was supported by evidence and entered knowingly. This review ensured that the acknowledgement was not symbolic but legally sound. Only after that review could the case proceed. The admission narrowed the remaining process. With responsibility established, the next step was consequence. The legal system would move from determining what occurred to determining how accountability would be expressed through sentencing. For the family and the broader community, the admission altered the landscape of the case. The long period of not knowing ended. In its place stood a defined outcome, grounded in law rather than speculation. This stage underscored a central theme of the case: persistence matters. Evidence preserved over time can support accountability, even when early answers are absent. The admission did not erase the years of uncertainty that preceded it, but it gave them meaning within a legal framework. By the end of this period, the Wilberger case had moved beyond investigation and renunciation. Responsibility had been placed on the record. The process that followed would focus on consequence, guided by the facts now formally acknowledged. The admission marked the point where silence gave way to record. The case had waited years for this moment. When it arrived, it did so through procedure rather than spectacle, confirming that accountability, when it comes, does not need drama to be complete. With responsibility formally acknowledged, the case moved into the phase where consequences would be determined. The focus of the court shifted from establishing what had occurred to deciding how the law would respond. This transition was governed by statute, precedent, and careful judicial review. Emotion did not guide the process, structure did. Sentencing required the court to consider the seriousness of the crime alongside the legal framework that applied. The disappearance had occurred years earlier, and the acknowledgement of responsibility came long after the initial harm. Time did not lessen the gravity of the offense. It shaped how accountability could be expressed within the limits of law. The court reviewed the factual basis that supported the conviction. This included the admission itself, the evidence that aligned with it, and the broader record developed during investigation and prosecution. Each element was evaluated to ensure that the outcome rested on verified facts rather than assumption. Sentencing guidelines provided boundaries. Judges do not act freely. They apply the law as written, weighing aggravating and mitigating factors recognized within statute. In this case, the court considered the nature of the offense and the long delay between the disappearance and resolution. The passage of time did not lessen the gravity of the offense. It shaped how accountability could be expressed within the limits of law. The sentence imposed reflected the legal conclusion of the case. It formalized accountability through imprisonment, establishing a consequence that matched the conviction. The decision was not framed as symbolic. It was procedural, deliberate, and final within the trial court. This stage did not revisit the investigation or reopen unresolved questions. The purpose of sentencing is not to reconstruct events, but to impose consequence based on established responsibility. The court remained focused on what had been proven and admitted. Public attention returned briefly during this period. The outcome marked a clear end to years of uncertainty. The case that had remained unresolved for so long now had a defined legal conclusion. The clarity came not through revelation, but through process. For the family and the community, sentencing represented a point of transition. The waiting that had defined the case for years gave way to a fixed outcome. The court's decision placed the matter firmly within the historical record, no longer subject to uncertainty. The legal resolution also demonstrated how older cases are handled within the justice system. The absence of early physical evidence did not prevent accountability. It required a different approach, one grounded in restraint and precision. The conviction showed that a culpability can still be established when investigations adapt to limitation rather than resist it. The sentence itself did not attempt to provide closure in an emotional sense. Courts do not offer that. They provide judgment, consequence, and finality within law. In this case, finality arrived through careful adherence to procedure rather than dramatic confrontation. The conviction and sentencing also prepared the ground for what would follow. With legal responsibility resolved, remaining aspects of the case could be addressed without uncertainty about guilt. The focus would soon shift to completing the factual record. This stage marked the end of active prosecution. Appeals would remain possible, but the trial court's role was complete. The case had moved from disappearance to conviction through years of persistence and legal discipline. By the conclusion of sentencing, the Wilberger case stood as a resolved criminal matter. The law had spoken through evidence, admission, and judgment. The long period of not knowing had ended. In its place was a clear outcome, grounded in fact and established through due process. The justice system had reached its determination. What remained was to address the final unanswered element of the case, one that lay not in the courtroom, but in the physical record of what had been lost. After the legal outcome had been established, the case moved toward its final, unresolved element. For years, the disappearance had existed without physical confirmation of what had happened after Brooke Wilberger vanished. The investigation and prosecution had moved forward based on evidence and admission, but one question remained unanswered: where she had been left. That question was addressed only after responsibility had been formally acknowledged. Following the conviction, Joel Courtney provided information that led authorities to the location of Brooke Wilberger's remains. This development did not reopen the case or alter its legal outcome. It completed the factual record that had remained incomplete since 2004. Law enforcement acted carefully as the information was received. Any recovery connected to a long, unresolved disappearance requires verification and controlled procedure. Authorities coordinated across jurisdictions to ensure that the location identified could be examined properly and that evidence would be handled according to protocol. The remains were located in a remote area far from Corvallis and far from where the disappearance had first drawn attention. The distance underscored how easily a case can extend beyond its point of origin without leaving early signs. What had once appeared contained within a single community had, in reality, stretched across state lines. Recovery teams worked under controlled conditions. The goal was not investigation in the traditional sense. Responsibility had already been established. The purpose was confirmation, documentation, and preservation. The remains were recovered and examined to confirm identity and complete the official record. Forensic examination verified that the remains belonged to Brooke Wilberger. This confirmation aligned with the admission already entered into court records. The discovery did not introduce new facts about the crime. It validated what had already been acknowledged and resolved legally. The recovery brought clarity without altering accountability. The legal process had already concluded based on evidence and admission. The discovery did not change sentencing. It did not reopen proceedings. Its importance lay in completeness rather than consequence. For the family, the discovery carried meaning beyond legal terms. Years of uncertainty about Brooke's fate ended with confirmation. While the law had already established responsibility, the recovery provided an answer that had remained absent since the day she disappeared. The broader community also responded quietly. The case had followed a long path, and by this stage, attention was measured. There were no dramatic developments or sudden revelations. The discovery was received as a final step in a process that had unfolded over many years. From an investigative standpoint, the recovery illustrated the value of persistence and evidence preservation. Even after prosecution, information can emerge that completes a case. The justice system allows for that possibility without undermining prior outcomes. The discovery also highlighted how long unresolved disappearances can remain incomplete even after legal resolution. Accountability does not always arrive at the same time as physical answers. In this case, the order was reversed. The law concluded before the physical record was finished. The recovery did not attempt to reconstruct events or assign new meaning. It was documented, verified, and entered into the record. That documentation ensured that the case file now reflected both legal and physical confirmation. With the remains identified and recovered, the timeline that began in 2004 reached its final point. The disappearance, investigation, prosecution, conviction, and recovery were now part of a single continuous record. The case no longer contained unanswered factual elements. The identity, responsibility, and outcome were established. The recovery closed the remaining gap, not through discovery of new wrongdoing, but through confirmation of what had already been acknowledged. By the end of this stage, the Wilberger case stood complete, not because it resolved every emotional question, but because it answered every factual one that the system could address. The disappearance was no longer defined by absence. It was defined by record, accountability, and confirmation. What remained was not investigation, but reflection on how a case can move from uncertainty to resolution over time, guided by evidence, restraint, and process, rather than immediacy. The case ends not with discovery, but with definition. Over time, uncertainty narrowed into a clear outcome shaped by persistence, evidence, and legal process. What began as a disappearance in a familiar college town moved through years where little seemed to change until the direction shifted and responsibility was formally established. The early response in 2004 showed how quickly concern can turn into action. Search efforts were organized, information was gathered, and the disappearance was treated seriously from the outset. Even so, the absence of physical evidence limited progress. That limitation did not reflect neglect or delay. It reflected how some crimes leave no immediate trace and how investigations can be constrained despite timely response. As years passed, the case remained present within law enforcement systems. It did not advance, but it did not vanish. Files were reviewed periodically, information was retained, and the possibility of future movement remained. This quiet persistence became critical later, when developments outside Oregon created an opening that had not existed before. When a suspect emerged through unrelated investigations, the case did not move forward on assumption, it moved forward through comparison, verification, and restraint. Timelines were aligned carefully. Connections were tested rather than declared. The work focused on what could be proven rather than what might be inferred. Legal proceedings followed that same discipline. Prosecutors limited claims to those supported by evidence. Courts evaluated responsibility through established standards rather than emotion or expectation. The admission of responsibility placed the central question on the record and allowed the case to move toward resolution without forcing certainty where time had erased detail. Sentencing brought consequence to that responsibility. The court's role was not to recreate the past, but to apply the law to what had been established. The outcome reflected seriousness without excess and finality without spectacle. The legal process reached its conclusion through structure rather than drama. The later recovery of Brooke Wilberger's remains completed what had long remained unfinished. It confirmed what had already been acknowledged and allowed the physical question of her disappearance to be answered. The discovery did not change responsibility or outcome. It brought completion to a timeline that had been open for years. For the family, the end of uncertainty came in stages rather than a single moment. Accountability arrived first through the courts. Confirmation followed later through recovery. Together, they provided clarity that had been absent since the day Brooke disappeared. For the community, the case became a reminder of how quickly routine can break and how long answers can take. The resolution did not erase the years of waiting. It placed them into context. The disappearance was no longer defined by silence, but by a clear conclusion reached through effort and time. The case also reflects how justice can operate across long spans. Early action mattered. Preservation mattered. Careful decision-making mattered. Each stage influenced what became possible later. The outcome was not immediate, but it was deliberate. There is no attempt here to assign meaning beyond what the events show. A young woman disappeared. Years later, responsibility was established. The process was slow, not because it lacked urgency, but because certainty required patience. The final measure of the case lies in its clarity. What was once unknown is now defined. The disappearance, the investigation, the admission, the sentence, and the recovery form a single sequence. It ends without mystery, not because every detail is known, but because the central question has been answered. What remains is the understanding that some cases do not resolve quickly, but they can still resolve fully. This one did, through time, persistence, and a legal process that moved carefully until it could move decisively.